All right, welcome to this episode of Monetizing Your Mental Capital. I'm your host, Will Christensen, and I am super excited. Today, we have a very distinguished guest. I'm going to let him introduce himself. Patrick is joining us today. And Patrick, I'm going to open up with our classic question. Why would an e-commerce seller who's looking to monetize their mental capital be interested in hearing from you?
Well, I got started with my first e-commerce website selling pecan gifts and nuts and chocolates in 1996. We had to invent a shopping cart to make it work. In the 2000s, I built a SaaS product that was sort of a combination of MailChimp, WordPress, and Shopify before those things existed, before the word SaaS existed. Nearly went bankrupt after got hacked by Russians. And now I run a services agency in Austin, Texas, helping e-commerce sellers, and I host Shopify meetups around the country.
There are so many questions coming to my mind right now, not least of which is how you escaped the whole situation of, getting hacked by Russians and not going bankrupt in that situation. That sounds terrifying. Pecan, like chocolates, you said?
You can do almost anything with the pecan. You can flavor it with jalapenos, with chocolate, with caramel. You can make pecan pies and all kinds of things. So yeah, for roadside stand, an I-20 in Alabama, we helped them move to the internet in 96.
Interesting. So there was a roadside stand doing all sorts of different pecan stuff, and you approached them and said, "Hey, let's put you online."
Yes.
And they were like, "What's online?" Probably because in 1996, I was 10 years old. I actually remember that time frame because I can remember, sitting in front of my computer and waiting for the dial-up connection to actually, make that all come together.
Well, they were a business that was resilient and creative. I think my memory serves, they started in 1935. So they'd weathered some changes and learned to evolve. And they had a bustling stop on I-20 heading west from Atlanta. And we helped move them and their mail order catalog business online. And then I went and I spent much of the 2000s helping other mail order and catalog companies move online. And in that sense, we were helping to bring that, that put your check in the mail, check the boxes of what you want to order, maybe from the J. Crew catalog or all the different things you could order back in the day and send it in the mail. And now we could do it on a website. And we started to care about things like email and email marketing. So when I say I developed a SaaS product that was a little bit like MailChimp, because MailChimp hadn't been invented yet, or was a year or two later. And the same with Shopify, which came along in 2006. And so we were just trying to cobble together solutions to things that were part of this transition from an analog world to a digital shopping environment.
The digital transformation, I've got so many questions that are going through my mind right now. The first question I'm going to ask is this actually. Can you remember, is this the first time you can remember monetizing mental capital? Like early on, think lemonade stand. Like how old were you in 1996 when you were digging into that?
I had just graduated from college. I was 21 years old. That was my first job,
And
building
did
a e-commerce store.
did you graduate in like computer science to like figure out some of that stuff, or were you just like, I'm gonna figure this out?
No, I worked my way through college building websites.
Interesting. And so what made you decide to build websites?
Well, I was interested in politics. I was interested in journalism. I was an editor of the student newspaper, and I went to work after graduation at CNN.com. They had hired a webmaster, which was a new term at the time. They're going to make CNN a website, have news online. You can get it faster and all the rest. And so my hope was to go there, and the guys who were getting that started, the original producer and the webmaster, whatever that was at CNN, said, Patrick, you could come and join us here, but next week we're going to quit. We're going to start building websites for business. We think it's going to be a big deal. And I thought, I think they're right. I think there's something to be said for having business, e-commerce, website stuff happening. It's probably going to be around. I'm going to try that out.
We're gonna quit because we think websites for businesses might be a big deal.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately, that startup company went bankrupt before the year ended, just before my first child was born.
oh, so you went to go work for them at that startup.
Yes, that's what I did. I took them up on their bet and I raised, and me and my pregnant wife launched into the internet startup world in 1996. And the company lasted till Christmas. So
Oh,
it's one thing to have a good opportunity. I think when you think about your opportunities in business, so much of it is riding the wave as the market grows.
mm-hmm.
But there's also something to be said for being a little too early. And it's difficult to sell something that people don't understand and don't quite know they need. And so here we are looking back, and we can have a chuckle about it, and that roadside stand in Alabama still going strong with their Shopify website today. But the effort and the pain of building a shopping cart that can take one checkout and ship to multiple shipping to addresses, because grandma, when she gets her gift catalog in November, October, she sends one
Mm-hmm.
to her kids and her grandkids, and there's 10 different boxes of chocolates she's going to send. And she
Mm-hmm.
wants to have one checkout to get out through the process, right? Just as she
Mm-hmm.
does with her one catalog printed order. So we
Mm-hmm.
were inventing those things at that time. And it's only later, someone comes behind you, someone like Shopify who waits till 2006, 10 years later, and then comes in with an elegant and rides that market wave as it goes forward. So I think anytime you're trying to figure out this is a great opportunity, you ask yourself,
Timing.
yeah, timing is as much a part of it as whatever sort of secret knowledge you think you have in your head that's going to make this thing great.
So, Patrick, this is fascinating. We've had a couple of people on our episodes that have ridden different waves. We had a guy who was an ISP. Like he was literally out of his basement apartment in New York. He was like setting up an internet service provider, and he eventually sold the ISP to a large internet service provider. And he was so convinced that he was gonna, do this crazy big like music online store, like took out a full page ad in the New York Times kind of thing, and it flopped miserably. And then literally 5 years later, like exactly like you're describing, like, you've got guitar.com and these other things that are just making it big. If I'm an e-commerce seller and I'm trying to decide whether or not the product I'm trying to sell is too new, not enough people know about this to actually make it work. How do I know that? How do I know that I've fooled myself into believing that this is a thing that people actually want and need? Like you mentioned, like not enough people understood what a website was or why it would be valuable, and which is why that company went bankrupt. They just were too early. How do you know when you're too early?
I'd like to answer that by thinking about 10 years ago. And if I were to answer that question 10 years ago, I might have said, run Facebook ads as a test. And that's because at the time, Facebook ads 2014 were super cheap. People hadn't optimized. You could get a meaningful test on a product without blowing all your cash. And today, I wouldn't say that. In fact, just yesterday, I saw someone post a kind of bold LinkedIn proclamation that said D2C e-commerce is no longer valid as a product launch strategy. It's not the right channel to launch anything anymore. And their encouragement was go into a retail space.
Interesting.
Now, I'm actually in Miami, and tomorrow I'll be talking with a guy who's helping develop small startup retail spaces for e-commerce stores or e-commerce sellers who are wanting to get some sort of exposure in the physical world. And I think that's the answer to the question today. I'm not sure I'm quite as convinced as the guy yesterday, but I do think that in the real world, physical spaces is a better place. Feedback on testing your next product and look at people in the eyes, hear what they say, listen to the grunts and the ahs, see how they
Interesting.
handle it.
That is super interesting. So I just got done going to this conference. It was a fractional conference, and fractionals is kind of a new wave that's happening right now where there are people who are quitting corporate America and they're going to work and help like smaller startups or smaller companies. So they'll be like the fractional head of marketing, working at three companies at the same time, kind of thing, above board, not the people who are like double dipping salaries and trying to pretend they're full time. Like they actually work fractionally for multiple places. I'm walking around at this conference and I had this backpack. Let me show you this. And this backpack, you can't even see it with all the crazy stuff. It has an LED on the back of it, and it rotates pictures on that backpack, right? So like you can actually put like words, and I'm walking around and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, where did you get that backpack? Where did you get that backpack?" Like they're all coming and talking to me about it. And I was like, just out of curiosity, how much do you think that backpack's worth? And they were like, $200, $300, $500, because we're at a conference, right? And so like it is like very timely, like, wow, I wish I had a backpack like that. Like, and what I found is people didn't read the backpack, but they sure wanted to talk about it, which is why I wear it. It's a fantastic conversation starter. The thing that I kept thinking about is, man, if we could figure out how to actually sell this thing, like you can buy a backpack like that on Alibaba for like $20. Like it is not a very expensive item. And hearing you say like D2C is no longer the place where you want to launch a product.
Well, begin to think about how many e-commerce sellers are happy with the return on ad spend on Facebook right now.
Oh, probably not many.
Yeah, you can't test something there. You have to refine and optimize something there. Now, I guess another way I might answer that question is, well, what kind of email list do you have? What kind of email list do you have access to? Because I think there's another guy was telling me the other day how much sponsorship in email newsletters or other people's newsletters is a great way of testing ideas because you can go to the niche that newsletter caters. You can get a relatively good, cost per millions or cost per thousands sort of price, and you can experiment and learn from that, even if you don't have your own email list. Now, if you did have your own email list, and I think that if you think about monetizing your mental capital, how much can you monetize if you bring from one business to the next a growing accumulated list of email addresses? I mean, today, I run an agency that focuses on email and retention and lifecycle marketing. And a company came to us. They had run several experiments over the last 10 years in different European countries, different brands, different products, a lot of them from China, always just, home furnishing kinds of stuff, interior design, and unique, clever things like hairbrushes, all very creative products. And they tested them in different markets, Germany, Italy, and the rest, under different brand names. Well, their challenge to us was, okay, we're going to start a new brand. We're going to consolidate our learnings. We're going to pick the best-selling products. We're going to launch under a new consolidated brand name that nobody knows. And here we've got 80,000 email addresses left over from our misadventures the last several years. And we accumulated those through Facebook ads and, opting ins and so forth. So they spent a ton on Facebook ads, and now they have 85,000 emails, and they're going to launch a new brand with an updated product catalog. So the challenge to us was, how do we organize this email list, communicate to people who don't know us or don't remember us, at least under the new name, which we're now selling, and use that list as the platform that gets us launched? Because just spending money on Google and Facebook to try something new isn't going to work. And so that's a great launch strategy. That's the challenge that we had to solve for them.
Interesting. So it sounds like, especially D2C, it's way less about the product, and like the first hurdle probably more needs to be the distribution channel. Like, how are you going to distribute said product? How are you going to test to see whether or not you've even got legs in what you were originally thinking might be a good idea?
Yeah. So I think your question was about testing a new idea. That's my answer, I think. Yeah.
Interesting.
In
Interesting.
person and email, I guess, to recap.
In person and email. And would you say in person? So, like, if I was an e-commerce seller and I was trying to diversify, find new products to list, kind of dig into some of those different pieces. Obviously, I might have some, knowledge to try to help myself get some of that figured out. But what would I do? Like you mentioned the in-person side. Like how hard is it to get into like do you mean in person as in like go to the flea market kind of thing in person? When you say in person, what would you recommend?
Man, I haven't been to a flea market in some time. I don't know, do they still exist?
They
They
do.
probably do. But I guess when I think about it, I host in Austin the Shopify meetup. And I also do that here in Miami. The people who come to those meetups are young and encouraging sellers who want to find a way to see if their product's going to have life. I met one woman who used to work at Facebook, and she was going to instead now sell a product that was basically a tea set. I want to say it was like not a toy for little girls, but it was like for women or people, whoever would want to have tea, but within a clever kind of packaged setting that, anyways, she's like, I'm gonna bet my Facebook stock portfolio, whatever, on this new product idea. And going to small market settings was a wonderful feedback mechanism for her. I hosted an event a few weeks ago and we had a vendor village, which is to say we had a tables and people, we had 10 vendors at our event. And one of them was a woman who used to work at somewhere like Google, who was fired and has a story now of launching her own product company that's based on her Indian heritage and is food. It's frozen packages of dal and lentils and spicy stuff in a pack. And she was able to serve me some. She got immediate feedback. She had, she was selling them hand over fist at our event, 10, $20 a pack of this new, CPG food product
Interesting.
with immediate feedback.
So when you say in person, you mean like go find an event that'll let you buy a table that's got a couple hundred people at it and see if anybody wants to buy your stuff.
Yeah, and if you're smart about it, you take as many photographs as you can and you maximize your social media exposure after the fact. And you get email
Very
addresses if you
interesting.
can, right?
Yeah, yeah. Get those email addresses, connect those dots. So, as an e commerce seller, there's obviously lots of different ways that the email address stuff happens.
And as I think about that, my event where I think about the story of the woman selling the packaged frozen Indian food, it was about a month ago. And I bought something and she got my email address and I've not heard from her since. And I can't actually remember the name of the company. And so here imagine in the last 2 or 3 weeks, if I'd been starting to be introduced and warmed up and did how she got my email address, maybe she's too new that she's like, oh, I'll get to that later. Nah, but those email addresses are precious and they degrade rapidly over time. So I should be having some sort of welcome flow or sequence using a tool like Klaviyo, which is what we use for our clients, to get me reminded, my enthusiasm at the time. I remember buying some packages and I'm like, I'm gonna get two more because I've got a son who's in college. It's be perfect for him. Like he can just have them in the free, take them out, right? And I can't remember the name of the company now.
Yeah, that's like a punch to the gut for her, right? Because it's like it was so good, but how do you connect those dots? You can remember how it tasted, but you can't remember what the name of the company was. And I
She had
wonder,
good packaging, maybe more professional than you might otherwise have when you're just a few months out of the gate. And I can see it green and yellow, and I don't know what it's called. But man, if you'd been in my inbox, I would know.
right? And beyond, well, and you'd have happily given your email address to her
I
because you
did.
wanted. Oh, you did already. You
Yeah,
did give your inbox
yeah,
your email, but it's not. But there's nothing in your inbox from her yet.
right.
So there it sits dormant. So Klaviyo,
Yeah.
what any other recommendations for a seller who's capturing email addresses, either from a warranty campaign or get a free gift card, XYZ, whatever. What other ways would you recommend actually making use of that email list versus the situation with this unfortunate individual who hasn't actually emailed you yet?
I think there's an example that comes to mind. This was a wonderful company that was created by a young woman just 22 years old, and now she employs her whole family and like 20 people. They got a warehouse, they got all kinds of things happening. She's just 22 years old, just graduating college. And they were very used to sending emails through like a once a month newsletter, using MailChimp in the classic way it always has been used. Once a week, maybe, if they were, if things all came together.
Yeah.
And what to us for help with was to bring more automation, more things that are just sent based on when something happens, like opting into the mailing list, making a purchase, not finishing your checkout, all basic things that are triggers for when an email should be sent. And so we moved them from MailChimp to Klaviyo. And I just got notice from yesterday from someone on my team who said they went back and checked, and this is like been 2 months since we sort of finished that. They have not yet pressed start on their welcome flow in Klaviyo, which is to say, for the last 2 months, people have been coming to their Shopify store, knows how much Facebook ad money they've spent or whatever they've done, travels. They also go to events and are actually very successful there, live in person. Things like Comic Cons is a big deal for them. But now they have this queue of emails that have been collected for the last couple of months that are not receiving any emails from them. And I think this is bringing a larger example. This is an example of a larger dilemma that companies sometimes feel like, well, I have to wait until I get it right. And
Mm.
so they're intentional. This company is a wonderful brand, very conscientious. And I bet they're just busy. Like they got to the Comic Con in Atlanta, the Comic Con in LA, and they haven't quite got to press start on a welcome flow automation tied to their Shopify store that should be sending out emails to everybody just the same day they opt in. And there's probably the hope to make it good enough or better, or maybe have 2 or 3 or 5 emails that are perfect to orient them to the brand, to feature their best-selling products. They just hadn't quite got to that yet. So it's like I would just say, start with the minimum viable welcome flow, which is one email, and then add a second one, which is imperfect. A third one, sent 5 days later when you start to feature a best-selling product, and not hold out for the best when you can just have good enough. And that's true when you're launching anything.
Okay, so how do you combat the fear? Because for me, a lot of times it's been fear-based. When I've had an idea or I've had a product or whatever else is there, I'm like, I'll get to that. Because the dream still exists if I say, I'll get to that. But if I actually do something about it and I fail and get rejected, all of a sudden, dream's gone. Boom. Which is, I think, a lot of the reason people don't move, like why they look to make it perfect. Like, I just can't undo a first impression. How many times have we heard, like you just got to make that first impression awesome. How do you overcome that?
Psilocybin. I'm joking in part, but you know, in my experience, I've done some experiments with mushrooms and psilocybin, and it has helped me drop the perfectionism in meaningful ways. And I can't say I have all the answers to why that is, but it's amazing how you can move forward when that perfectionist tendency starts to ease back a little bit. Now, this is an important distinction because I said good enough, and then you said, I'll get to that. And I have been vacillating between that for a long time, because I told you in a moment in the beginning that I was hacked by Russians at one point, building this software as a service, SaaS, first turnkey product. And when I said it was a combination of MailChimp, WordPress, and Shopify, it's because it truly was trying to be all those things, which was because I needed all those things at the time when I started. This is 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. And when you have a scope that big, you can never get it. And you'll say, oh, I'll get back to that. We can't make it perfect. We have to just like crash forward with a good enough minimal viable product. But the scope from the original expectation was all the things we needed for an e-commerce seller. And we needed all those things, which meant we couldn't get to take care of the things that were mission critical all the time, or we'd say, I'll come back and I'll get to that later. And if you're in the software world, had any experience there, there's this phrase called technical debt.
Hmm.
At the time, I was in my early 20s and didn't know better. I did have an employee who was almost 60. He had worked at big companies like Electronic Data Systems with Ross Perot back in the day. He's like, this technical debt is going to come back and bite your ass, Patrick. I know you think you're trying to move forward at a pace that you think is good enough. You will get to that. But the thing is, Patrick, we'll never come back and get to that.
We'll never fix this.
And I didn't believe him. I didn't believe him until one night I got a phone call from another guy on my team. I didn't know much, but I knew to hire good people. So I had this, nearly 60-year-old whiz programmer. And then I had another like 60-plus-year-old long-haired hippie from the 70s. He was a Unix guy. He was a server administrator. He knew, more than I've ever forgotten. And he called me up one night. He's like, Patrick, I think root has been compromised on the server, which is a Unix guy way of saying that we've been hacked.
Yeah, we've been screwed. Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Root is like full access to everything.
And, he's one of those guys that I'm not going to argue with him. He's right. And you can't even he couldn't even explain how he knew exactly, but he knew. And of course there was evidence, but it wasn't like there was a clear explanation who it was, what they were doing, how long. I mean, there was access and details. And he's like, the problem, Patrick, is that remember that it's the backup server. It's the backup server that we don't really paying attention to. All our attention's focused on rack space in Dallas, Texas, where the big data center runs, but we have this backup that we just, oh, we'll get to that. So data was transferred through a backup process. It was unencrypted. So the credit cards went into plain text on the backup server because the
Oh,
backup process couldn't
fudge.
handle the encryption. And now he said we have tens and tens of thousands of unencrypted credit card numbers on this server that's been hacked.
Oh my gosh. That's like every SaaS founder's worst nightmare right there.
So I have some strong feelings how that story, I could tell you the rest of that story or whatever, but I have some strong feelings about this idea of, oh, we'll get to that. But I also just a moment ago was saying, the
You got to be
minimum
fine
viable
with good
version,
enough.
good enough. And I think that as my experience as an entrepreneur, I've been running my own companies in one form or another for almost, well, basically 24 years. In one way or another, I struggled to understand the balance between what's good enough and, oh, we can get to that later. And what's worth launching today and getting feedback in the marketplace and not holding off for perfect. And that's been my lesson. So when I said earlier that I'm trying to step back from some of that perfectionism, and I actually have felt a real shift and a movement in a good way. I think there's something where it's like it's the right balance for you. It's probably individual to you as to your boldness and your caution. And another way of saying that is your sense of alarm or your drivenness, the intensified pursuit of what you think you're going to accomplish,
Hmm.
with being able to be sensitive enough to hear the warning bells. And I think there's a lot of times we can numb ourselves to the feedback that we're getting and what we
Hmm.
feel or what we don't feel. So much of
Hmm.
an entrepreneur is guided by their intuition. I mean, I can talk about data and email marketing metrics and
Yep.
about this and the other, but there's then that moment you're like, are we going to do this? And to be sensitive enough to feel the alarm bells or the caution that your body is wanting you to recognize, and then being convicted enough to say, we're going to make this happen, and not being willing to, be discouraged by setbacks is the ultimate test, right? It's that
Hmm.
fine line there. And I'm wanting that for myself.
Hmm.
I hope to feel like I'm more tuned to that but it's something that I'm still confronted with.
There's two things that you said that I think are very interesting. You mentioned the mushrooms and the mushroom therapy. I've heard a lot about the mushroom therapy. I, for one, do trauma therapy on a weekly basis with a therapist. EMDR is what I'm doing.
Hmm.
And it has changed who I am in all the right ways because I no longer step into a situation and those alarm bells go off because I lost my mom when I was 10 years old from breast cancer. I'm no longer transferring that experience onto a project manager who's decided to
Yeah.
quit.
Mm.
Right. So, like, I'm able to become more real with reality and not ignore or be blindsided by some subconscious part of myself that's uncomfortable with a certain situation. So I can get more real about the situation by dealing with my past trauma. So and I think those mushrooms fall into that same category. The friends I've talked to about that, that's kind of what they've said in terms of how they've, the experiences they've had, um, kind of
Yeah.
connected with some of those past selves. So I do have to hear the end of this story though. So you have 10,000 some odd credit cards that are
Yeah.
sitting on this
Let's call
server,
it 50,000. Yeah.
50,000
Give or take.
50,000 credit cards sitting on the server. You're fairly confident it's been hacked at this point. What do you do?
He asked me, said, Patrick, are we going to call Visa in the morning? Because the payment card data security standard mandates that for a software platform of our caliber, we had to be payment level one certified to the standard that Visa insists all its merchant banks and merchant processors and merchants are adherent to. So our customers, the e-commerce seller, had agreed implicitly to follow Visa's security rules, you know, as a process of accepting payment. And they transferred that obligation to us as their e-commerce software provider to follow those rules. And
Right.
by not encrypting the credit cards in the way we had meant to get back to later when it transferred to our backup server,
Mm,
we had violated that agreement, which means our merchants had violated the agreement, which meant that the banks that serviced them had violated the agreement, and Visa starts passing out fines at $250,000 a pop. And $250,000 fines to everybody starts cascading down. And if shit rolls downhill, I'm at the bottom of it. So that's an interesting question. Would you call Visa in the morning or would you hope for the best? And maybe no one will notice.
I mean, I don't know what else you can do but call Visa. Like at that point, if it's been hacked,
It wasn't clear that they realized what they had hacked their way into because, again, this was a backup server tucked away in the middle of nowhere that wouldn't have a big neon sign on it as to what it was. Well, this weighed heavily on my heart. Yeah, I remember dropping to my knees and like basically like crying.
sobbing. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I there's no other way to put it. What do you do? Like, I'm done. This is done. Like, how do I, yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's so many times you have a moment where you're like, I knew I shouldn't have, or I knew I should have, and like you knew it. And I didn't have a conscious decision about anything having to do with the encryption. It was never like something that I gave any big meeting discussion to. It was just one of those things just pushed off for later. And that's the nature of these things is they accumulate. And before you know it, a minor sort of consequence becomes a staggering consequence.
Mm.
But years later, I heard someone say it this way. I like to take my pain early.
Mm.
I think I like that phrasing of it. And that's what I did the next morning. I did call Visa and tell him. And I remember the woman working to me from San Francisco was like, okay, you're going to call this guy and he's going to do an audit. You're going to call this guy and you're going to do that. And like everyone bills at $300 an hour. We're going to be on conference calls for a year, like trying to get to the bottom of all this while you become certified and also become accountable for any fraud that's resulted. So I thought that was going to be a hard conversation, but then I remembered I had to actually call my customers and tell them this as well because my customers needed to keep paying me, right? I didn't, there was no venture backed funding of this. It was all on my own shoulders and bootstraps. So we were funded by the merchants who we help, sell things at Christmas for and get ready for the big sales. So
Yeah.
I needed to get enough of them to be able to stay with me and keep paying while we worked out how best to handle this. And those were some
Wow.
hard phone calls. Those were some hard phone calls, and they were certainly not emails.
No, that was not an email. Oh my gosh.
So I made a list. It took me about a week and a half to call everybody, and we had that conversation. And I got some pretty good feedback because, in the same way, to go back to my story about those merchants trying to get little feedback on a new product in the marketplace, they go to some vendor village or whatever the situation is. And I said that they can hear like the little grunts and the ums and the ahs when they're looking at handling the product. I could listen to my customers and hear the gut clenching, you know, the the F bombs, right? The things that I could see when I ended that conversation. Sometimes it took, 10 minutes, sometimes whatever, but I ended that conversation and I could write down next to that person's name, okay, I think we got them. I think they're still a customer. I think we can help fix this with the money that they will keep paying. Or others, clearly it wasn't. And if I would have sent off a bunch of emails, I'd just be sitting in my office hoping and guessing, and I would never know. Now,
No.
people ended up changing their mind, and some people stayed for a while, some people left later, but we had a pretty good majority that hung with us, at least enough to help us make that process happen over the course of the next year or so. And so in 2006, when Shopify released itself to the world, I was working with Rackspace to help us all understand what Visa's payment security standard actually meant in practice. And we all, dragged ourselves across the finish line in a way that, in the end, nobody was charged with fraud. And we were certified, and my team was exhausted, and I was broke just in time for the 2008 recession.
Take your pain early. Take your pain early.
Yeah, that 2008 recession year is kind of fixed in my memory. And I was thinking about it earlier today because I was interacting with a client in the present that is showing some of the signs, an e-commerce merchant, some of the signs of what I witnessed in 2008, where there was a feeling of desperation for the fourth quarter of the year to make up for a shitty first half part of the year. And if you're in the e-commerce business this year, your sales are not where you want them to be. I mean, maybe you got an exception here or there, but it's been a tough year. The return on ad spend is disappointing. People have big hopes for Christmas season this year, but now it's almost November when you're recording this, and there is a sense of urgency and great intensity in how merchants are trying to prioritize their ad spend and their marketing and all the things that are happening, putting money towards inventory and the rest. Do you see that?
It's definitely my experience as I talk to multiple people. There's definitely a tightening of the fist going on and not as much movement as, and there are exceptions. I'm seeing other places where some things are moving forward, but I am seeing that.
Yeah. And so I had a conversation yesterday with a client where I could see that there was that similar sense of urgency and desperation. And what happened to me in that 2008 fourth quarter was I was wanting them to be successful. I want my software product to be successful for them. And I threw everything into making the fourth quarter a success. And what happened in the first quarter of 2009 is a couple of those clients went bankrupt, for no lack of effort on our part or their part.
Yeah, it was just where it was.
Yeah. And then I was left with big bills that were unpaid come January. And we actually had a model that was more performance based. So our revenue was skewed towards the latter part of the year. And the bills and debts that I had to face in 2009 brought the end to that software product.
Yeah.
And by that point, Shopify's momentum back in the day, you may remember Magento, big momentum at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you think about where you are in the market. In some ways, I was too early in the e-commerce software business. You could say that. You could also say I was too broad in my scope of what the product was trying to solve. And so, you have to be thinking about today and what you're doing. How much of a problem are you trying to solve? Maybe you have a product that could solve half of what you think you're trying it to do and could be even more clearly understood by the prospective buyer of it. I'm thinking about like, health products or whatever you're selling, things that aren't trying to fix everything you think your customer needs, but having a sharper, clearer, and narrower focus where you don't overextend yourself. You don't try and pin all your hopes on the fourth quarter and blow your wad, so to speak, but you take yourself a smaller bite out of the apple. You chew a little more measuredly. You live through and have enough cash to carry out first quarter and be both ambitious and realistic. That's what I hope for myself.
I love it. You have shared some sage wisdom, and I think I've gone on the emotional roller coaster with you. I felt that phone call from your developer in the middle of the night. Like, I think Root has been compromised. That is just wow. If you could make a phone call right now back to the guy who was building that website for the pecan company, you could make a phone call back to him and you knew he was mature enough to actually receive the advice, what would you tell him? What would you tell him to do differently in this journey of monetizing mental capital besides like buy Apple stock or buy, but besides all of those obvious things that we would do to become billionaires because we know where the market's going? What would you tell him to do?
I think it's not that different from what I said a moment ago about finding the balance between that ambition and the sensitivity to understand and listen for those alarm bells of where you're overreaching. And I didn't have that very well developed. And, a lot of entrepreneurs have a hard-headedness that is, I want to say inevitable. I want to say it's almost required,
Yep,
right?
I
And
agree.
so to be both persistent and attuned to the feedback from what you're getting, both from your customers, the market. But hey, what about your team? Because you remember I told that story of the old guy who was like, Patrick, this technical debt is going to bite you in the ass. And I was just, I didn't want to hear that because it
Yeah.
got in the way of my vision.
Yep.
And so, there's a book, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and they had this notion of visionaries and integrators.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had a vision for what I wanted to do, I didn't want anyone to constrain that for me. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, by constraining it, I could have had maybe a much more narrowed value proposition to what I was really trying to
Yeah,
solve.
you might have been Shopify
Yeah,
had
if I
you.
didn't have to build WordPress and MailChimp at the same time, I probably could have just done Shopify, right? You know,
Hindsight's 2020, right?
but what probably will, unfortunately, I would look back and say, I was unlike the guy who started Shopify, less willing to turn over ownership to investors and venture capital. Now, I didn't have a lot of sophistication of that, but I also had a sense of wanting to feel in control.
Mm,
And the guy who started Shopify owns a very small part of that company today.
right. But it's
7 billion,
Shopify.
7 billion in revenue. But hey, so even that is an aspect which maybe is another conversation.
Yeah.
The desire for control of the entrepreneur's livelihood and product vision
I,
is as much a factor as anything else.
I think what you just said right there is actually my response to how do you find out. So I'm a visionary. I've read Entrepreneur's Operating System, the book Traction. I've even read Rocket Fuel, the book that where they actually like dissect visionary versus integrator. And my response has been to find integrators quickly. Find an integrator as quickly as possible Find somebody who is going to have that working genius. If you're going with Patrick Lencioni's framework of, he talks about the five working geniuses: wonder, invention, galvanizing, and tenacity. So those are the five working geniuses that he talks about. The discernment part, like the like, oh, now we got to decide which of these ideas actually goes somewhere. It's actually six working geniuses. So wonder, invention, discernment, galvanizing, support enablement, and tenacity. So like it's the arc of a project or the arc of an idea or something actually coming to fruition. And that discernment piece is where we decide if all the invention stuff and the wonder stuff is actually going to come to fruition. Like which of these ideas is actually good. I suck really bad, really, really, really bad at discernment. And so finding somebody who's strong in that area, who has some really solid intuition to be like, not a good idea, not a good idea, not a good idea, not a good idea. And then recognizing that having four bad ideas and one good one is actually pretty good. Like recognizing that my job as a visionary is not to have the perfect ideas. It's to produce a lot of them so that somebody who has better intuition than me, better tap on how to actually create something real out of what I'm putting out there, can like pull the reins on what I'm working on. Have you found that to be the case as well for you?
I think there's something to be said for that. Are you open to a question back to you?
I love questions.
I think what you might consider, if I hear you say that, is how do you plan for time away from your business, time where you're not so much in it, and the discernment that you're asking another to do might be one of the products of some of that away time from your business, that some of the urgency drops away. And I don't mean like going on vacation necessarily. And it could just be a meditation, in the afternoon when you otherwise would be working. That discernment is the crux of it. And I almost wonder whether you can outsource that, because it's like there's data-based decision making, and you could have people give you data, and you could even have recommendations, but the discernment of, are we going to do this, yes or no, ultimately rests with the entrepreneur. And I feel like that discernment is something we can't quite turn over.
I have found, so I love this, and the conflicting conversations. I think there's a lot to be learned here, and we're wrapping up our episode. But the thing that I would say is I have tried it with someone who did not have a ton of experience and all of the knowledge that I had. And I outlaid, here's exactly why I think we should do this still. Here's all of the reasons that are there. But in the end, I've recognized that discernment is not my working genius. So your call. And I have found that I got better results. And we missed some opportunities. We've had some opportunities, but I've had better results when I find someone I can trust who is willing to listen to all my ideas and shoot them down. That one's actually got legs. Shoot them down. That one's actually got legs. It's been interesting. And we haven't hit, I mean, there's definitely pieces of that. And I love what you said about away time, meditation time, because that is where I give myself enough energy to actually consider the different things that are there that I can discern, right? And so I definitely have done that as well. But finding
I
someone
would
who
say, yeah, I
thrives
think
there
maybe
is good.
we're wrapping up our conversation, but I would just one back to you and say, and as much as I said a moment ago about how that can't be delegated as much and the entrepreneur maintains that responsibility, you've actually touched upon something that is really important for me to be learning. I've tried to learn it, is how we can rely on other people to help us just by being present in our process. There's some neuroscience understandings around co-regulation, how the brain connects with other people, feels more relaxed just in the presence. And so I've learned in many ways this in part from my wife, who sometimes will say, look, I've got a really difficult email to write. You just sit alongside me here at the table and, you're just with me. And
Yep.
I'm going to take this difficult thing and do it. And so in a part, you're having someone, by shooting ideas down, they're as much as anything else, they are
Holding
engaged in
space.
relation with you. Yeah.
Holding
And
space.
you are more relaxed and comfortable making decisions with their presence as much as you might imagine them shooting things down.
Patrick, final question for the episode. where can individuals reach out if they want to connect with you? What's the best way to connect?
Yeah. Well, you're welcome to check me out at patrickpitman.com. I also write at easierbusiness.com. If you're into e-commerce stuff, frankly, e-commerce.com.
All right, that's it for our episode of Monetizing Your Mental Capital. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Will.